So as spoken earlier, I tend to split my resisted runs into heavy, medium, and light resisted runs. And generally speaking, these are some of the focus or some of the ways which I will apply these different runs. So a heavy load, I will tend to use for 5 to 15 meters in length. And for me, the purpose of these runs is a switch quality. And again, I'll show you some photos and some videos in a minute as to what that looks like, and staying stiff on contact. So this is something I learned from Jonas, who again, many of you will know in the sprints world, obviously globally renowned sprints coach. Again, he uses heavy loads as a way of teaching the athlete to be stiff on the floor. And I'll show you an athlete who perhaps lost some of that stiffness through the ankle on a photo in a minute. For me, the focus of a heavy weight is not to push the weight. So I personally don't use this to have athletes really overextending. My focus actually on a heavy load is frequency and therefore being in a good position on the contact. Again, I'll show you what that looks like in a minute, and staying stiff on contact. And I see that a heavy load I use as a repetition of the first 2 to 4 steps of acceleration. So them steps where you want to have a little bit more of a piston action rather than a cyclical action of the hill. My medium runs I use from 15 to 25 meters. And on these runs, I tend to use it for a focus on projection and progression of the hip height from low all the way through to the end of the acceleration. So I tend to use it. So in this instance, I will be encouraging the athlete to push a little bit more and to project their center of mass horizontally. As I said, the other thing I will use this for will be the teaching of progression of hill recovery height from piston to more cyclical. I'll also be teaching progression of the hip height from low to high. The one thing I always try to encourage my athletes to remember about when they're resisting is that if we're doing a resisted run over 20 meters, unresisted, you almost want to be in a similar position as to what you would be at 15 meters. So I don't see them as 20 meters resisted is going to look exactly the same as 20 meters unresisted. I think 20 meter resisted looks similar to what it looks like at 15 meters unresisted. And the reason for that is because you've got the load, you're able to start more horizontally. So you're not starting from necessarily the same point as you would be unresisted. So you're able to hold a more horizontal body angle for longer. Hence why at 20 meters with a load, you're not going to be the same as 20 meters unresisted. You're probably still going to be slightly more horizontal at that point. Finally, I would then potentially use a light load of up to 30 meters in length. And at this point, I'm then starting to overload something which is a more specific race rhythm at that point. So the one thing it might enable the athletes to do, or almost bridge that period of time between using a medium sled, whereby you have more time on the floor and more time to get your body into position. I think a light load can bridge that gap between a medium run, where you've got lots of time, and unresisted run, where you have very little time at all. So that's how I use a light load. I use it to overload a slightly more specific race rhythm. And what this might encourage athletes to do by being a little bit closer to their race speed is that it might just give the athletes a little bit of support to be a little bit more horizontal than maybe what they could ordinarily be unresisted. So as a way of maybe encouraging them to be brave almost and be braver in terms of how horizontally they project themselves, I think your light loads can really benefit that for sure. So 5 to 15 meters in length. As I said, one of the components that I look for is the ability to switch. So we've got the image on the left, which is a heavy run. And as you can see on contact, the athlete's knees are relatively close together. So again, that's what you want from an acceleration standpoint. And I think heavy loads you can use to teach this. If we then look at this athlete's block run, which is on the right, so again, we're keeping our end goal in mind here. Again, we see the very similar position. We've got the heavy loaded position on the left, which I'm using as a teaching tool so that this athlete can do it unresisted on the right from blocks. As I said, just a reminder, this focus isn't about pushing the weight. For me, it's a repetition of them first 2 to 4 steps. So I'm just going to show you a video as to what this looks like in action. So the actual frequency of this is actually builds to quite a high rate. So he's not pushing the sled. He's not spending ages on the floor. He's staying stiff on the contact. And I'll show you a couple of photos in a sec. He's staying stiff on the contact. And then working on the frequency and the ability to switch. I'll play it one more time. So again, notice the stiffness on the contact. He's not over pushing the weight. He's not traveling 3 meters per step or anything like that. He's hitting the deck and ripping the hell out of it. Okay, so okay, again, I'm going to show you a couple of photos that go alongside this as well. So this was a different athlete, and we speak about stiffness in the system. This was also with a heavy load. And one of the things that we want to try and create on contact is the feeling of stiffness through acceleration. And as we can see from this athlete, and the top left photo, this athlete has hit the floor. This is his initial ground contact. But because of a lack of stiffness in his system, what's ended up happening is that heel has dropped significantly. So this athlete isn't able to be stiff on the floor with this kind of load. The athlete who just went in the video, his heel would not drop anywhere near this amount. The athlete who I showed you from blocks in the beginning, his heel wouldn't drop anywhere near this amount. Again, you can use jumps, you can use calf loading and isometrics and all of that stuff to develop stiffness, and they're great tools. Actually, I think that you can also use heavy loaded resisted sled sprinting as a way to challenge that athlete's stiffness in potentially a more dynamic way as well. So again, we will use heavy loads alongside calf loading and small pogo jumps and this, that, and the other to develop a level of stiffness within the athlete. I said, this is not the only tool in my toolbox that I have for developing this quality, but I think you can use resisted sled sprinting to encourage the athlete to be stiff on contact. I say compared to this athlete here, this athlete would have been a lot stiffer on contact. And you hear that as well as you'd see that in photo form as well. We then have a medium, and just a reminder that we use the medium to focus on projection and progression of the hip from low through to your upright position, and the progression of your heel recovery from more piston-like to more cyclical-like from your initial acceleration through to upright. Again, just a reminder that where you are at 20 resisted is going to be very different to where you are unresisted. And again, just a reminder about how all this puzzle fits together. The photo on the left was from week 2 of winter training last year. The photo on the right was from a block run just prior to lockdown, like mid-February time of this year. So that's our start point for teaching progression on the left. This is where we end up at on the right. Again, similar shapes, similar flexion of the hip, similar length created in terms of an extension pattern as well. This athlete is clearly projecting themselves forward along the track. So in terms of videos, again, this is from the same athlete who did the heavy 10-meter one a second ago. This would be a medium resisted 20. One thing I want you to notice is the rhythm is very different now at this point. So the rhythm is a little bit longer. It's a little bit more about projection as opposed to being stiff on contact and ripping fast. This one is a little bit different. So again, not the world's best medium run I've seen. Again, I probably could have shown you a slightly better potential video, but the rhythm is different. The rhythm is more about actually spending a little bit more time on the floor to project himself. And even within here, you're still able to embed some of them qualities that you would have on a on a heavy acceleration. So again, in terms of the switching, you're still able to embed that in. You're still able to see that when his foot hits the floor, the knees are relatively close together on contact. So again, some of them themes that we have in a heavy sense, I might not focus and emphasize so much in a medium sense, but you can still see them in there. So again, that's what I would tend to use my medium runs for. Tend to use them for a projection of the body, i.e. potentially slightly longer ground contact times. I want to see, again, a big open shape in terms of acceleration as well. So again, that was from about 10 days ago or so. And then the light load. So for me, as I said, I use light loads to focus on an overloading of a slightly more race-specific rhythm. And again, it might encourage athletes and might provide a little bit of support of athletes to be a little bit braver to project themselves horizontally at a slightly more race-specific speed. So again, the one thing I want you to, again, keep looking at. So again, one of the things I said about rhythmic, how I can develop rhythms through resisted sled sprinting. We had our heavy, which was about being stiff and switching fast on contact. I then got my medium, which is a little bit more of a projection. So the rhythm is going to be slightly slower than unresisted sprinting. The light load is going to hopefully reflect a little bit closer some of the rhythms which you would have unresisted. So whereas the heavy run perhaps had a frequency which was quicker than what you would have unresisted, and the medium load is a rhythm which is potentially slower than what you would have unresisted, my light rhythms I tend to use for sticking much closer to the kind of rhythms that you would have in an unresisted block run or an unresisted run from a full or a 3-point or however you want to use it. So again, I'll play it one more time. Again, just look at the rhythms. Again, a lot of the same shapes still apply here. So we're still seeing some projection of the body, but again, it's a little bit more specific to what he would do unresisted. Would you say that if they can wall drive correctly, they are ready to progress to a harness? So what's interesting is that I think with wall drives, I'm assuming you mean the one where your arms are on the wall and you're doing switches and this, that, and the other. I think actually what you can use a harness for is you potentially could use it as a more dynamic version. So one of the things I've not discussed in this presentation is about pushing things. So this is about almost pulling things and having a sled behind. What you can do is that you can encourage them to push something in that same kind of position. I can't believe I'm about to do this live to 75 people, but I'm going to kind of show you what I mean. So sometimes we don't even use something heavy for this. We might just use a hurdle. And again, particularly if it's been raining outside, the hurdle might slide along the track quite nicely. So what you can do is imagine that this is my hurdle. You can have your hands on the hurdle into that wall position. I don't know how much you can see, and then push and get into that position. So again, similar kind of positions to what you would have on the wall. So you start in this position, hip flex, pushing down underneath you, and you end up pushing the hurdle along. So again, you can do that with a really lightweight. So again, at times my guys have just used a hurdle for that. You can do that with something called a prowler push or a sled, or however you can basically get more load, and you can really load that up. So to answer your question, Sally, I think if they can do a wall drive, then I think a way of progressing that into a more dynamic wall drive would be potentially to do it as a walking wall drive. The one mistake that I often see athletes make when doing that is that they think they have to go forward a lot. The crucial thing when doing these wall drives is that you get the foot actually behind the hip and almost underneath / slightly behind the hip. So actually per step, they're not actually going to travel that far. If they're traveling a long way per step, what they're probably doing is putting their foot in front of their hips and almost pulling themselves forward, as opposed to pushing the ground away. And that's a cue which I'm sure some of you will use already, about acceleration being about pushing the ground away. So I think absolutely. I think the other thing you can do, Sally, as well is I think you can use resisted sled sprinting to also teach some of them positions. So again, using a heavy load where they're really well supported horizontally, actually almost just doing it as like a high knee exercise. That's kind of what the heavy load is. It's almost like an extended high knee exercise because you want them to see that piston shape rather than a cycling shape. So I think absolutely, if they can do that, then definitely I think you can move them onto a harness. For me, I think even you could use the harness to help teach that shape as well. So yeah, hopefully that helped.